You're listening to Halfway There, episode number 194, Jeff Munroe and Stewarding Your Pain. If you're a reader, you're going to like this one. Well, hey friends, welcome to Halfway There. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. I'm your host, Eric Nevins. Thank you so much for being here. Every time you download, I see that and I get very, very excited because I know that you're going to hear a conversation that is going to help you on the journey, remind you who you are, who God is, and why he's put you in the world. So today we have a really great conversation. Our guest is the Executive Vice President of Western Theological Seminary and author of the book Reading Buechner, which is interesting. He's got an interesting story on how that came about. Our guest is Jeff Munroe. Jeff, welcome to Halfway There.
Thanks, Eric. I'm really happy to be here. Really excited about our conversation today. I love what you do, so really happy to be invited to be part of it.
Thank you. I'm glad to connect with you. So it's interesting because your book Reading Buechner is coming out or is out by IVP, right? They publish it.
Yes.
And I do a lot of work with IVP. Many of our authors are from InterVarsity Press that we feature here. But you came to me a different way because you spoke at my cousin's church and. In Kansas City, and we have mutual friends. Jim Gum is a previous guest. You know him. And so he said, hey, you need to have Jeff on the show. So I'm really glad to make the acquaintance. And I know Buechner is kind of an interesting story, the way you dove into him for your own personal formation, which is what we like to talk about here. So tell us a little bit about yourself and where God has you right now.
Yeah. You mentioned I work at a seminary in Holland, Michigan, Western Theological Seminary. And you mentioned Jim Gum. I know Jim because he and I worked for Young Life together. I worked for Young Life for 29 years. And along the way, did a Master of Divinity degree here at this school, was the director of Young Life in Western Michigan, and then was the director of Young Life in Western Europe for a couple of years. And after that, came back and started working here 8 years ago. So I'm involved in administration, fundraising, communications things. And along the way, I got invited through InterVarsity Press. I've had a long interest in Frederick Buechner, and then got invited to put this book together, and it's out now. It came out about 2 months ago. Came out at the end of November. Yeah.
Well, I want to dive into Buechner and the kind of the book, because I know that's part of your story. So let's go through that first, and then we'll talk about it. But basically, Buechner is a theologian, right? So that's
pastor, theologian, writer, novelist, lots of different hats.
Nice.
Yeah.
So a lot of evangelicals may not have heard of him, but he definitely influences them in some ways, right?
Yes,
that
he
they
sure does.
Probably don't know, which is interesting. Yeah. Okay, so let's go through your story, and I know we'll end up getting to Buechner as we go. So tell me about where you grew up.
Yeah, I from Michigan, lived a little bit in Southern Ohio, but then went to middle school, high school, college in Michigan, mostly on the east side of the state of Michigan, and then came here in 1981, long before you were born, Eric.
No.
Sure.
I was born in 76, so I'm a little older than that.
Okay, well, you were 5. And I was sent here by Young Life to go to school and to become a staff person for Young Life in this little town of Holland, Michigan, among all these Dutch people.
Yeah.
So that's where it started. And that's where at this school, at Western Theological Seminary, is where I first started reading Frederick Buechner, was first introduced to him here.
Nice. How did you find Christ initially?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian family, but really came to my own understanding of the Christian faith through the youth group that I was involved in, and our youth group at our church was really styled after Young Life. So then I really, we would, even though we had kind of a regular youth group, we would go to Young Life camp in the summertime, and I couldn't wait to do that and work at Young Life camps, different things like that. So when I was in college was when I really felt called to ministry and loved Young Life. And so that's when I felt that call. It was also, I felt very specifically that I should be doing something with Young Life. So that's what I did.
Yeah. What was it about that? Was there anything you said was specific? Like, what was that experience like? Take us into that.
Yeah. Well, it was so much fun for one. Young Life's great fun and makes the gospel really attractive. And I just think of it as being cool, fun, adventuresome, great relationships, great friendships. It really came to define who I was and my understanding of the Christian faith. I wound up, as I mentioned, I think earlier, I wound up working for Young Life for 29 years in a variety of places, but I'm still connected. I'm doing something with Young Life on Friday.
Yeah.
That's been consistent throughout my life.
So for people who don't know, tell us what Young Life is, because I don't know if everybody knows exactly all of what they do.
Yeah. So Young Life is a evangelical outreach ministry aimed at adolescents. Their mission statement, they got a great mission statement. The mission is to introduce adolescents to Jesus Christ and help them grow in their faith. So it's both evangelical, but also discipleship oriented as part of it. They're really big, have grown a lot since the years when I got involved in the 80s. And it's part of that whole group of ministries that really started World War II era, came up. The majority of kids before that didn't even go to high school in the United States. And so when the majority of kids started going to high school and adolescent culture really developed was when Young Life, Youth for Christ, Campus Crusade, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, even InterVarsity, all those things started to develop in this country about the same time.
Yeah, very interesting. Because they come up once in a while, and I just thought it might be helpful to define that, especially since they've had such an influence in your life. Yeah. Okay, so that sounds like probably a lot of your discipleship, your early kind of learning and owning your faith and developing and discovering your gifts even happened in that context. Any stories that stand out to you for a time when maybe you discovered a gift or the Lord's moved you in some way that would be interesting to share here?
Yeah, well, I was a total goofball, Eric. Still am to some degree, but
you've got a good sense of humor. I know that.
Yeah, just a total goofball. Yeah, and you can't even see you and I are looking at each other. People are going to be listening to this. I'll just have to imagine us, but you can't even see in the background on my shelf my beautiful John Calvin bobblehead doll that I have. So that's who I am. Young Life definitely gave me a home. What I'd love to do is tell you this story about that involves Buechner, that really formative experience early in my life. So if you don't mind, I'll tell that.
Please do.
Take a few minutes. But it's a compelling story, and this is a story I use in the book that I wrote. 1985, I was so I came here and worked for Young Life full time and was taking classes part time at the seminary. And so I took my time going through the seminary. The joke at that time was that at one point, one of the professors said to me, "We're either going to put you up for tenure or graduate you, one or the other, because you've been here for so long." But in 1985, I was taking classes here. I was leading Young Life, and I'd gotten engaged beautiful young woman named Gretchen. She was very fit, healthy. She was an aerobics instructor. And we were going to get married in August of 85. And 1 month before our wedding date, she had a massive stroke. She was going to make dinner for us that night. I was house sitting for a high school kid, with a high school kid, taking care of the house and him for a week while the parents were away. And I remember that day that I was sacked out on a couch in the living room. He was sacked out on another couch. We had a Cubs game on. Harry Carey was droning on in the background.
Yeah.
Gretchen was going to make us dinner. She came in from work. We gave her a hard time about kind of waking us up. And then she went into the bathroom and just a few seconds later called to me from the bathroom and said, "Jeff, come here." And I got up and went there. And when I went in, she was standing up, and I could see something was wrong. And she said, "Something happened." And actually what I noticed was that there was some drool coming down the left side of her face, and that the right side of her face was starting to seize, was like having tics, and really strange. And I said, "Can you walk to me?" And she said, "Sure." And she tried to take a step forward, and she stumbled, and I grabbed her and pulled her out and woke the high school kid up. And we were, Holland's a small town. We were just around the corner from the hospital. So I actually just put her in the car and drove to the hospital rather than calling an ambulance, because I could get there in a minute. And I drove 70 miles an hour down a residential street. And by this time she was paralyzed on the left side of her body, while the right side of her body was full blown into seizures. So her right arm was flying around, her left leg, or her right leg was flying around. The other side was slumped over. Drove into the parking lot of the entryway into the emergency room crazily. And a nurse was coming off of work, and she saw the way that I drove in and knew something was wrong, grabbed a wheelchair, helped me get Gretchen inside. And then this is something else that I just will never forget, was she slumped over in the wheelchair with her right arm and right leg going off into these seizures. And the person at the emergency room desk said, "Well, is this normal behavior for her?" And I just wanted to scream at that person and say no. And we got her into the emergency room. I thought she was having a stroke. That is indeed what happened. No explanation for that. She was 24 years old, totally paralyzed. And the story I tell in the book is, there's lots of things I could tell about. We're married to this day. It's going on 35 years. But at that point, as I'm sitting in the emergency room, waiting room, I made one phone call. Other people came in. The person I called other people. Big group of people came in and sat with me, which was wonderful. All kinds of folks from our Young Life Committee, other friends were around. But I was sitting at one point between two older men, both guys that I respected a great deal. And this is a couple hours after the event, and all the adrenaline that had kind of fueled my rush to the hospital was wearing off. And I just started to think, what's going to happen? I didn't know if she was going to live or going to die. If she did live, I was wondering what she was going to be like, was how much damage was being done to her brain right now, how much damage was being done to her body. Mm-hmm. And I started wondering if we were going to get married or not. And I just started to cry, sitting there. And one of these guys next to me put his hand on my shoulder, and I'll never forget this. And I thought he was going to say some, fatherly words of wisdom or something. And he just said, "Get a hold of yourself. Don't do that. Don't cry. Stop crying." And he said, "She needs you to be strong. You've got to be strong." And I took his advice. I just stopped crying and I stopped feeling. I stopped feeling what was happening at that moment, and I buried the pain that was going on. And I would say from that point forward, for several years, the only experience, the only emotion that I could name was numbness, other than from time to time anger. And so some time passes, like 7 years pass. We got married on a weekend pass from the hospital. Gretchen was, I had to take her, we got married on a Friday night. I had to take her back to the hospital on Sunday. She was in the hospital for several more weeks. It was a year before she could go back to work. It was 5 years before she could drive again. She gave birth to our 2 wonderful kids. They were both high-risk pregnancies, but everything went well. But I, through it all, was just kind of a runt, a pygmy, in terms of my own emotional development and ability to feel and to say what was going on with me. And it was Frederick Buechner that changed my life. It was reading something by Frederick Buechner that changed my life. And, I think as readers, we go to books, at least I do. And I can see you've got this huge library of books behind you as you're talking to me. I think you do too. We go to books and we expect or we want lots of different things, but I think more than anything, we want books that change our life. The people that are authentic enough with what they write about, that they actually change our life. And that's what Buechner did for me. And I was in the bookstore, I have a very vivid memory of this, and I saw a new book by Buechner called The Clown in the Belfry. At that point, he'd become a great hero of mine, literary hero of mine. And I saw this book and I thumbed through it, and I saw that there was an essay in the book called Adolescence and the Stewardship of Pain. And the idea that Buechner had written anything dealing with adolescence, because I still worked for Young Life at that point, was really intriguing to me. And then the idea of stewardship of pain, I had no idea what that was about. Stewardship, the line I use in the book is stewardship was one of those church words that sounded about as exciting as mortgage amortization. But what he does in that essay is he looks at this passage in Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, and he imagines, what if pain is one of the things that God gives us in this world? And the question for us is, what do we do with it? Are we stewards of it? And he uses the example of the three servants in that parallel. One gets 5 talents and trades and makes 5 more. One gets 2 talents and trades and makes 2 more. But the third one with his 1 talent, what does he do? What does he say? He says, I was afraid. I was afraid. And so out of fear, he buried his talent. He buried, and Buechner says, what if it's pain? Out of fear, you bury your pain. You bury your life. And I was reading that, and I just started to weep. And I remember very clearly saying, how does Frederick Buechner know so much about me?
Wow.
He didn't know me, but it was like I was reading my story of having buried my life in a sense. And he says that place that we get to there is a place of weeping and of gnashing of teeth and the outer darkness. And we actually cast ourselves into it. And that was really profound and really transformative for me. And so this idea of becoming a steward of your pain, becoming a steward of your life, that really, really was deeply formative and powerful for me at that time, and set me on this journey. I'll tell you one more quick story about that, Eric, just about telling that story, because I've told that story, dozens of times, different groups over the years. And one of the first times I told it, I remember I was speaking at something, and I remember a guy, after I'd finished, I talked to a few people, and then I actually just needed to go to the bathroom. So I was walking into the men's room, and a guy followed me into the men's room to tell me about the death of his daughter.
Wow.
And and just not what you expect, but what I realize is pain is the universal human experience, and giving ourselves permission to talk about it and to feel it, to share it with each other, to somehow become stewards of it, is really can be a really liberating experience. So that's a great gift that Frederick Buechner gave to me. It's just a small piece of the whole corpus of his writing, but that really it really changed my life, turned me around in a lot of profound ways.
Yeah. Well, I'm really interested in that. So during that period of numbness that you had, where did you think God was?
Yeah. Here's what I didn't. Yeah, that's such a great question. What I didn't feel like was that God was in it with me.
Mm.
I think theologically that's true. I really believe that God was in it with me. But my experience of God during that time, it was pro forma in a lot of ways, right? I was supposed to, I did things, I went through motions of things where I just didn't have it inside of me. And I had so many other things going on. I was young. I was leading a ministry. I was finishing up at seminary. I had this new marriage. We were having kids. There were so many other things that I had to do. And yet I still was plagued with a lot of sense of just not emotionally not being attached, maybe thinking the right things, but just not heart-wise feeling it.
Yeah. That's so interesting to me too, that we can get so just separated from our own selves, right? We can piece ourselves out like that. I'm curious how you feel about the guy who told you that, because that's like the least empathetic thing I've ever heard, right?
I actually write about that too. And here's what it's taken me a long time. What I realize now is, he's the one that gave bad advice, but I'm the one who took it.
Yeah. Right.
And he was just saying what he thought the thing to do was in the moment. And it's pretty typical masculine advice, if you think about it.
Yeah.
As men, we're told a lot in a lot of different ways not to have feelings. And so, I think I've gotten to a point of just saying, he was just saying what he thought was the thing to do. And it was me more than him that was responsible for what happened with me and what happened. He wasn't telling me don't feel anything for the next 7 years. He was simply telling me at that moment. I think he was kind of afraid of the fact that I started crying right next to him. He didn't know what to do with that, And so I think just in that moment he reacted the way that he did.
Yeah.
It was me.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow. That's a fascinating way to look at it. So how did you eventually, so you found Buechner, but and I guess you described some of that. I'm curious, how did your relationship with the Lord develop from there? I mean, did you begin to find more intimacy with the Lord after you kind of thawed?
Yeah. I would say that I did, and that, but I wouldn't say it's ever been a straight climb to the top, as much as a journey that we're all on that goes forward and backwards all the time. For me, I've found a lot of peace, I think, and it's taken me time to find that peace. I found peace in being in a community. The last 8 years at the seminary have been really rich for me in that way. What I'm really formed by today, and I'm really in touch with today, is living. I don't actually live here, but sometimes feels like I live here. Working, I should say, in a place that is a community of people that, we have a daily worship service, and the rhythms of daily worship so important to me. We have communion together every Friday. That's become, and that's not necessarily a real reformed, we're a reformed seminary.
Yeah.
It's not a reform thing to do. Sounds all pretty Catholic, right? But that's become so important to me. What I find is, I described it to a friend of mine as I spend the whole week figuring out all the ways I don't believe in God, and then the community calls me back to faith every week. And that experience brings me into intimacy with God. So being a part of the community has become really significant. Another piece just that Buechner's really helped me with is that Buechner's very open with his own faith and his own struggles and his own doubt. And one of the great, just to tell you a little story about him that has really, really helped me. His first job out of seminary was, he was a school minister at Phillips Exeter, pretty elite school on the East Coast in New Hampshire. And he was there in the late 50s and into the mid 60s at a time of great social unrest, Vietnam War, civil rights movement, all that stuff was going on. And he says that the student body was dominated by students that identified themselves as negos, Negos, that were negative about everything. They were certainly negative about authority. They were negative about the war in Vietnam. They were negative about the government. They were negative about the school. They were negative about the chapel that they were forced to go to, about the school minister that led that chapel that they were forced to listen to. And so as a preacher, Buechner would climb into the pulpit every week and look out at that sea of kids who were there, or every day. And then every week they had a weekly service too, a Sunday service of kids who were there against their will. And he said what he saw emblazoned on the forehead of every one of those students was 3 words, a question: is it true?
Wow.
And that really shaped him and formed him as a preacher, to think that everybody that you're talking to, everybody that's listening to you when you preach, comes with that question in their mind. They want to know if it's true. And how we experience that in our own lives and have the ability to talk about it truthfully with each other is what I think makes a huge difference. And that's why Buechner another reason why he's meant so much to me, is because he does talk in very honest ways about his own experience with God. And that's become really significant to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you heard me say our tagline is honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. And I think that's because it really is valuable to be able to talk about what you're experiencing with the Lord. I think we passed 300,000 downloads not too long ago. And I think people find that, hey, if maybe I'm not alone, right? Just like you said, I'm not alone if I also go through doubts or I have this situation. We've had so many people, all kinds of situations people have, but I always think if somebody else is in a similar situation and they get to hear that, hopefully it'll help them. Hopefully it'll remind them that God will get you through it, even though it's difficult.
But, in the world of theology, sitting as I do in a seminary, experience, certainly in Reform circles, they're a little suspicious of experience, right?
Indeed.
They like things to be objective, and experience feels very subjective. But again, I'm atypical in that way. I just think if it's not true in your own life, how can it be true?
Yeah.
And one of Buechner's lines is that all theology, like all novels, is actually autobiography.
Oh, yeah.
That every doctrine was an experience before it was a doctrine. So I'm really drawn to experience and drawn to him as a writer and to other writers that I find that have the honesty to talk about their own Christian experience in a way that that rings authentic and true.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's all over Scripture too. So, like obviously Scripture is the authority, but it's, you can't read the Psalms and not see the idea of experience, how they're experiencing God, be that way. And when I started to read even the prophets, I wrote a little book. It's 6 pages. It can't be a book. It's like an ebook, but it's about Habakkuk, because Habakkuk has this interesting little interplay with God. It's just the story. They call him a complainer, but it's the story of him taking what's upsetting him to God, right? And then God responds, and then he's like even more upset, and he takes it back to God, and God responds again, and it ends with worship. But it's one thing to read that from a theological perspective and have all the, this is what God's doing, and that tells us something about Babylon and all that. That's fine. But to read it for Habakkuk's experience changed my life, right? Like to realize that not only was God not mad that Habakkuk questioned him twice, God engaged him and gave him answers because he honored that. And that's where we get the righteous will live by faith, right? He honored that here Habakkuk comes to him.
Yeah, a lot of us have trouble with the concept that not only is God not mad at us, but he actually loves us.
Yeah.
Wants the best for us.
He wants to be with us, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, I love that. Okay, so Buechner's had a huge part of your discipleship and your kind of thought life, for sure, in your heart.
Yeah.
Wow. Have you ever been through a dark night of the soul? I mean, maybe going, feeling like you were 7 years detached from your emotions is one, but have you ever had a time when God felt far away or distant?
Yeah, I would say so. I left Young Life at a time like that in my life. And part of that was we'd gone to Europe. And I thought that was going to be a move that was going to be the last thing I was going to do. I would stay there and do that through the rest of my career. And after a number of months, maybe 9 months, I just was like, this is not it. And it was personally really difficult. It was professionally really difficult. And so I always think if something is difficult, but professionally you're doing well, you stick it out. Or if professionally something's tough, but personally you're doing well, you stick it out. But both of them were not going well. And I just felt like it was time to pull the plug on it and admit that I had failed at something I thought I was going to succeed at. That I was at the end of a road and I didn't know what was going to happen next. I resigned in a hotel room in Spain, which is not the way I ever imagined my life coming out. My career, 29 years in a particular ministry.
Wow.
Came back to the U.S. I resigned. I didn't get fired. I could have gotten so much more money if I would have got fired, right? They'd have to pay me severance after 30 years of severance or something like that. But I didn't do that. And came back and came back home and didn't know what was going to be next. And so that was really a difficult time, an empty time. And I don't have any I didn't have any. So then I picked up this book and it changed my life.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I don't have any great picture for that other than there are times in life where you just keep putting one foot in front of the other and kept going on. And then this is something I'll tell you 2 stories that both have to do with how I think sometimes this is the reform piece of me, that God's providence, that God's sovereignty comes through in ways that we don't imagine. So I came back and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And so I cobbled some things together and I had this unplanned sabbatical. I was doing some stuff for InterVarsity, actually, through a friend of mine, doing some consulting because I'd raised a lot of money with Young Life and to do the European thing. And then I'd raised some money for a Young Life camp. So I was doing some consulting with InterVarsity around fundraising, just doing preaching and teaching and writing stuff when I could. And then out of the blue, one day, I get a phone call from a guy who I knew, but I didn't know. We kind of were aware of each other, but we weren't really close. And he said, "Hey, I want to know if you want to be the vice president of Western Theological Seminary."
Wow.
And I said, "I don't know if I want to be that or not, but I'd be interested in getting together and talking about it." And so, I tried to find jobs. I'd applied, and I'd had 2 or 3 experiences where I came in second place for things. And at the time when I got this phone call from this guy, I was like, I'm not ready. If you're talking to me about entering a pool with 12 other candidates and coming to the end and getting rejected again, I don't think I can take that.
Yeah.
I don't think my ego could take that again. And so he just said, well, come in and let's talk, and then get together with the president and talk. And that was so that was life-changing, but it was not something that I sought. It happened to me, and that's why I think of the Reformed sense of God's grace. Sometimes things happen to you. The second story has to do with the book and how I came to write it. And that is that I've done a lot of Buechner stuff over the years at different things. Kind of got a reputation in some circles, I guess, as being a Buechner expert. There was a thing for a while called the Buechner Institute I was on the board of, and I used to do presentations there. And through that, met some other people. Well, through that, I got an invitation, this is in 2017, I was invited to go to a writing workshop at Princeton Theological Seminary that was named after Buechner. It's a Frederick Buechner writing workshop, and to talk about Buechner at it. And so I did, and there were maybe 300 people. They had Anne Lamott was the headliner.
Oh, wow.
Big name. There were all these people there. So then I'm doing my little seminar, and 20 people come. I mean, maybe 20 people come to my seminar. So I was so frustrated because I was like, hey, I thought, 300 people, at least, 100 of them should have come to my thing, but they didn't. So 20 people come, and I do my dog and pony show about Buechner. I told the story about Gretchen Stroke that I told you as part of that. And there's a guy that's sitting in the front that's really kind of into it. And so when the thing ends, he comes up to me and tells me how much he enjoyed it, and introduces himself and tells me his name is Jeff Crosby, and that he's the publisher of InterVarsity Press.
Wow.
He's the president. He's the CEO of IVP. And so I was like, wow, that's really cool. And then a day later, I run into him again, and he says, hey, did you see what I put on Facebook? And, I'm like, we are now, but we weren't then Facebook friends. I didn't know what he put on Facebook. And so I said, no. And he said, well, I put on how much I enjoyed your presentation yesterday. And I said, thanks, that's nice. And he said, and then a friend wrote, get him to write a book. And I wrote back, I intend to. And I was like, oh my gosh, really? And so that's where that came from. It was not something that I was seeking to do. It came to me. And then he was doing this kind of funny. He was doing a seminar on putting together nonfiction book proposals. And I had not intended to go to that seminar because I wasn't doing something. And then all of a sudden I'm like, I need to go to that seminar.
Maybe I need to figure that out.
Yeah. So I go to it. And this is even funnier. I go to it and I'm sitting there and I'm taking copious notes because this is everything I needed to do. I was learning. And somebody asks him, is it true that you would actually meet somebody at something like this, an unknown person, and they would wind up getting a book deal from you? And Jeff Crosby says, yeah, it's already happened here. Looking around thinking, wow. And then I realized, oh my gosh, he's talking about me.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's how this whole thing happened. I put a proposal together, tons of work, lots of research. put a proposal together, and that was in. I think I got signed the contract about the 1st of November 2017, and the book was out by Thanksgiving of 2019. So 2-year process.
Yeah, it takes a while. I've been doing some work with a little publisher here in town, and I had no idea how long books take and how long that process is. It's an awful lot between, like you said, a proposal to actually work in the manuscript.
So here's an interesting thing, Eric. There were times I've always liked writing. There were times in my life when that would have been like it for me I would have loved to have something like this happen.
Yeah.
And when it did happen, I wasn't looking at all for it to happen. And that's an interesting thing to me on sometimes the way things work out, or Buechner would say that our lives have plot lines.
Yeah.
Working in them, the way that God moves things around in our lives. That maybe sometimes at the time you want it, you're probably not ready. In some ways, you get to a point where you don't want it, or not so much don't want it, but you're not seeking it. Then it happens, and maybe you're better off than being able to deal with everything that accompanies it.
Absolutely. Wow. I love that. You never know. It's hard. Waiting is hard, right? Being in that season when it feels like God is not giving you the things you want, but sometimes you just need to wait. And I think that's one of the morals of the story.
Yeah. We're asked a lot in the Christian life to be patient.
Yeah.
And I don't think that patience is a virtue that our culture particularly asks us to to develop. We just saw, just a sidelight, we saw the movie A Hidden Life Monday night, which is this fantastic Christian message in this movie. But the pacing of the movie is kind of slow. And it makes you think and gives you room to think. And it's demanding that you're patient. And I think the word was out because Gretchen and I were the only two people in this theater of 200 seat theater. And we had a private showing on a Monday night in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Wow.
I just think that's so countercultural to say, to be patient, to think, to take your time with something. And, but that to me, that's how we grow. That's what the Christian life is often about. And I think I've reached a point in life where I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it sounds like you are much more comfortable just being where you are and being who you are, who God made you to be.
Trying to, Eric.
Yeah. That's the thing, right? And it sounds like Buechner brought you there, as well as at least God used him as part of the story.
Yeah, very true.
Wow. Okay. Well, friends, I've got links as always to the book and everything that we talked about here. The book is Reading Buechner, Exploring the Work of a Master Memoirist, Novelist, and Theologian and Preacher. And so if you're interested, if you've never even heard of Frederick Buechner, you should pick it up, check it out, and at least use this as a starting place. I know I'm interested in reading The Clown in the Belfry because that sounds pretty interesting as well. So I got links to that and everything else in the show notes at halfwaytherepodcast.com. I love that. Jeff, do you have anything you want to leave us with?
Hey, Eric, it's just great talking with you. And I'd say God bless you and God bless the folks that listen to this. Thanks for the opportunity to share with you today.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate it.
Yeah.